The morning of August 15, 1940, broke clear and cold above the Sussex Downs. Flight Officer Geoffrey Wellum sat in the cockpit of his Spitfire at Biggin Hill aerodrome, fingers drumming against the throttle, waiting for the telephone to ring. It would ring in moments, summoning him skyward. But something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would alter the entire character of aerial warfare and the outcome of the battle itself. 30 miles to the south, along the coast, the Luftwaffe was already in the air, their bombers and fighters sweeping toward England in organized waves. The pilots knew they were coming. They knew the precise moment they crossed the channel. They knew their altitude, their direction, their number. They knew because of something the Germans did not even suspect existed. This was the secret weapon that would save Britain. It was invisible. It sent no bullets, no bombs, no shells. It could not destroy an aircraft directly. It existed in the form of waves pulsing outward through the atmosphere at the speed of light, translated into echoes dancing across the face of a cathode ray tube. This is the story of radar, and how a peacetime scientific curiosity became the instrument that intercepted an empire and prevented the conquest of Britain in its darkest hour. The legend of the Battle of Britain has long been told as a tale of gallant fighter pilots, their aircraft locked in desperate combat against overwhelming odds. But that is only the visible half of the story. The other half, the half that mattered equally, perhaps more, played out in a chain of concrete towers stretching from the north of Scotland to the south of Kent, in laboratories and operations rooms, in the minds of scientists and the steady hands of operators interpreting the green glow of oscilloscope screens. Without what was happening in those rooms, without the technology humming invisibly in those towers, the Spitfires would have fought blind, and Britain would have fallen. The problem facing Britain in 1940 was not new, but it had become catastrophically urgent. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Hermann Göring, possessed the most powerful air force the world had yet seen. Estimates placed their strength at nearly 5,000 aircraft, with perhaps 2,500 fighters and 1,500 bombers available for operations against British targets. The RAF possessed approximately 1,000 fighter aircraft dispersed across numerous airfields. On paper, the mathematics was brutal, but the true nightmare was not numerical. It was temporal. The Luftwaffe could attack anywhere, at any time, from any direction. An airplane moving at 300 miles per hour might take only 30 minutes to cross the channel, locate a target, and commence its attack. Defending fighters needed to be in the air before the enemy arrived, burning precious petrol, their pilots exhausted, their machines worn. You could not defend an island nation if you had no warning of attack. The previous methods of detecting incoming aircraft were medieval by comparison. The Aircraft Observer Corps, soldiers stationed with binoculars and telescopes across the countryside, could spot aircraft only when they were already overhead, and only if the weather permitted. The moment an enemy aircraft passed inland, it disappeared from sight. Pilots defending British airspace fought with an invisible enemy. They scrambled on rumor and estimation. They flew in circles consuming fuel, searching empty skies. The RAF's fighter strength, concentrated in the south of England and the Midlands, was finite. An aircraft destroyed was not easily replaced. Every wasted patrol meant one less fighter available when the true attack came. Every exhausted pilot meant reaction times diminished, judgment impaired, survival rates lowered. The British people, meanwhile, huddled in shelters while bombs fell seemingly at random. The Luftwaffe appeared unstoppable. They came when they chose, attacked what they chose, and withdrew beyond retaliation before effective opposition could materialize. The very speed that made the aircraft such a revolutionary weapon became the method of British defeat. Without a means of detection that could see beyond the horizon, that could penetrate cloud and darkness, that could provide warning not of minutes but of tens of minutes, Britain's defense was not merely difficult, it was theoretically impossible. And yet, in the gray concrete buildings and converted manor houses scattered across southern England, Teams of physicists, engineers, and mathematicians were completing work on precisely such a means. The first breakthrough had come years earlier, almost by accident. In 1935, the Air Ministry, desperate for some technological advantage, issued a challenge to the scientific community. Could anyone devise a death ray, an invisible beam of energy that might destroy enemy aircraft? Robert Watson Watt, a Scottish physicist working at the National Physical Laboratories Radio Research Station, did not promise a death ray. Instead, he proposed something more practical and far more powerful. He believed it was possible to detect aircraft by radiating them with radio waves and observing the echoes that bounced back. The Air Ministry was intrigued. Within months, Watson Watt and his team had demonstrated their concept using a BBC radio transmitter, detecting a Hayford bomber from a distance of 17 kilometers. The technology worked. What followed was one of the most extraordinary sustained efforts in British scientific and industrial history. The Air Defence of Great Britain program, approved in 1937, set out to construct a complete network of radar stations stretching along the entire coastline of Britain. The chain home system, as it became known, was the result. By the time war began in September 1939, the first stations were coming online. By the summer of 1940, when the battle commenced, the network consisted of 21 major radar stations and 45 smaller units, an electronic screen stretched across the nation like a nervous system, monitoring the approaches. The technical achievement was formidable. Each major chain home station consisted of 4 fixed radar towers constructed from steel lattice, enormous structures rising 350 feet, 106 meters, into the air, transmitter and receiver arrays built with the precision of musical instruments. The towers were deliberately left unfenced, exposed to view, because the Air Ministry had made a strategic decision. It was better that the Germans know the towers existed, they were impossible to hide, than to allow them to function unobserved. The Germans could see them. They could not see what they did. The radar itself operated at a wavelength of 10 meters, produced by vacuum tubes generating power equivalent to 100,000 watts, concentrated into pulses lasting microseconds. These pulses radiated outward at the speed of light, 300,000 kilometers per second, striking the metal fuselage of an approaching aircraft and bouncing back toward the receivers. The returned signal, minuscule beyond measure, often no more than a millionth of a milliwatt, was amplified millions of times by chains of thermionic valves and displayed upon cathode ray tube screens as a small bright blip against the darkness. An operator, trained to interpret the subtle variations in signal strength, could determine not merely that an aircraft was present, but its distance, its direction, and, through observation over time, its altitude and heading. The entire operation, detection, measurement, calculation, occurred in real time as the aircraft moved through the air. The manufacturing process was extraordinary. The radar sets were not mass-produced in the manner of consumer goods. Each station was essentially unique, customized to its location and terrain. The steelwork for the towers was fabricated in conventional engineering workshops but required tolerances far tighter than conventional building. The vacuum tubes, the genuine hearts of the system, British-made Mazda valves, some of which cost as much as a motor car, were manufactured in factories in London and other cities, each one tested exhaustively before installation. The cathode ray tubes, themselves precision instruments requiring magnification of received signals by factors approaching 1 million, came from similar facilities. Hundreds of skilled engineers and technicians were engaged in this work, drawn from universities, research institutions, and industrial companies. The Air Ministry coordinated the efforts with military precision, whilst allowing the scientists considerable autonomy. The result was a system of unprecedented complexity for the era, built in peacetime haste, but built with remarkable care. Production continued throughout the war years, with spare tubes, replacement towers, and improved models manufactured consistently. By 1941, approximately 150 chain home stations were in operation. The investment required was substantial, equivalent to millions of pounds in contemporary money, but the Air Ministry considered it justified by its potential. They were correct. The moment of truth came during the summer offensive of 1940. The German Air Force launched attacks in waves, attempting to overwhelm British defenses through sheer weight of numbers and repeated assaults. What the Luftwaffe encountered was not the unprepared resistance they had anticipated. When a German formation of 40 bombers escorted by 20 fighters crossed the Channel on the morning of August 15, 1940, the radar station near Dover detected them at a distance of 80 miles. Within minutes, fighters from 3 separate airfields, totaling more than 100 Spitfires and Hurricanes, were climbing toward them. The German aircraft had no idea they were expected. They had no equivalent system, no means of knowing that they had been detected whilst still far out over the North Sea. The result was a disaster for the Luftwaffe. 56 German aircraft were shot down. The British losses were 6 fighters. Similar patterns repeated throughout the battle. In operation after operation, British fighters appeared not by chance or luck, but by precision. They arrived at the correct altitude, at the correct position, at the correct moment. They attacked the German formations before the bombers could reach their targets. German pilots reported inexplicably accurate interception. Some concluded the British had spies within the Luftwaffe. Others speculated that some form of electronic detection was at work, but the very concept seemed fantastical. How could one detect an aircraft at such distances using radio waves? The physics seemed impossible, yet it was happening consistently, turning battles that should have been routs into grinding attrition that the Germans could not sustain. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. German pilots, believing they possessed superior aircraft and greater numbers, found themselves repeatedly ambushed by opponents who seemed to anticipate their movements. British pilots, meanwhile, fought with an advantage that was invisible yet absolute. They knew where the enemy was. They chose the moment of engagement. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, fought blind, their every movement observed and countered. The British advantage was so complete that modern historical analysis suggests the battle's outcome was predetermined once the chain-home network became operational. The Luftwaffe was not defeated by superior flying. They were defeated by superior technology that they could not detect and could not counter. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. More videos like this await. The Germans were not unaware that something was amiss, but their understanding remained incomplete. They recognized the towers. They called them the Funkmessgeräte, or radio direction finding apparatus, and attempted several times to attack them. The Luftwaffe conducted bombing raids against radar stations, destroying several installations. But the system was sufficiently distributed and resilient that the loss of individual stations did not cripple the network. More critically, the Germans never fully grasped the sophistication of what the towers could accomplish. Their own radar experiments, conducted primarily for artillery spotting and naval gunnery, operated on much shorter wavelengths and achieved detection ranges of only a few miles. They assumed the British system operated on similar principles and came to wrong conclusions about its capabilities. German intelligence reports on the system were vague and speculative. The very fact that the towers were visible, openly standing in the landscape, seemed to indicate they must be something simpler than their actual function. The most important factor, however, was simple. The Germans had no equivalent system, nor did they develop one in time. The Americans, by contrast, recognizing the tremendous advantage such technology conferred, moved swiftly to implement radar systems of their own. American radar sets, initially based on designs shared by the British, began equipping fighter squadrons in 1941. The Americans refined the technology rapidly, developing airborne radar sets for fighters and bombers that eventually surpassed even the British systems in sophistication. However, the British possessed the technology first, and that timing proved decisive. In the Battle of Britain, when the outcome hung in balance, When a few squadrons of fighters stood between invasion and independence, radar provided the margin. The Japanese, developing radar independently but more slowly, possessed only limited systems by the time of their war with America. The Soviet Union, ravaged by the German invasion, did not begin serious radar development until 1942 and never achieved systems comparable to those of the Western Allies. Only Britain and America possessed complete radar networks during the critical early years of the war. The legacy of chain home extended far beyond the summer of 1940. Throughout the war, radar systems became progressively more sophisticated. The British developed the GNL, gun-laying radar for anti-aircraft defense, the ASV, air surface vessel, radar for detecting submarines, and airborne interception radar that allowed night fighters to locate enemy bombers in darkness. Each innovation built upon the foundations established by the chain home research. When the war ended, radar technology had become fundamental to military doctrine and to civilian applications that continue to this day. Civil aviation, maritime navigation, meteorology, all were transformed by radar. That transformation began in a desperate summer in 1940, when a small number of British scientists and engineers created a weapon of such power that it could determine the fate of nations without firing a single shot. The lasting proof lies in the landscape itself. Several chain home stations remain standing today, their steel lattice towers still visible from considerable distances, monuments to an era when Britain's survival depended upon innovation in the face of impossible odds. The station at Bawdsey Manor in Suffolk, where Watson Watt conducted his first experiments, now stands as a museum. Visitors can stand before the original equipment, see the cramped operations rooms where operators watched their screens, and begin to understand how this invisible weapon functioned. Those who stood in those operations rooms during the summer of 1940 rarely spoke publicly of their work. Many were bound by official secrecy for decades after the war. Some never spoke of it at all, carrying their knowledge of what they had contributed to the victory into silence and to their graves. Yet the mathematics is undeniable. The Luftwaffe conducted thousands of sorties over Britain. They lost over 1,700 aircraft. The RAF lost approximately 500 fighters. Had those numbers been reversed, had British pilots been forced to fly blind whilst German bombers struck with impunity, the island would have fallen. The invasion would have proceeded. The war would have taken a completely different course. And none of that would have occurred as it did without an invisible weapon made of mathematics, vacuum tubes, and human courage. A weapon that won a battle not through destruction, but through revelation, showing British defenders exactly where their enemies were and when they would come. That is the true story of the Battle of Britain. Not the glamorous duel of fighters in the sky, though that was real enough, but the invisible battle fought in electromagnetic waves and on radar screens, where the war was won before the first shot was fired.